Okay, let's get right to our last part of the chapter on newspapers for COM 130. I want to talk about several different types of styles and models of journalism, particularly as practiced by newspaper people. Um, there's been a clash over the years, over the centuries actually, in lots of newspapers about what's called objective journalism versus what's often called story-driven journalism. And prior to roughly the 20th century, most newspapers sought to appeal to specific audiences. They were trying to make political points or statements. They may have been focused on urging economic reform. They may have been standing up for a particular point of view on a number of other social issues. And they made no secret of the fact that they were biased in favor of or against certain things. In 1896, the New York Times was a failing newspaper, and they were trying to compete with the sensationalism of Hearst and Pulitzer, who, as you might remember, developed these models of journalism that were far from objective. And so they had to do something to counteract that. And their choice was to try to become objective or impartial and to compete with them. In other words, try to be balanced, fair, give lots of different points of view, let readers decide what to make of the issues without trying to inject too much opinion into the process. Now, the New York Times, like every newspaper, has opinion pages and what are called op-ed pages. We'll talk more about that. But for the most part, it's built its reputation on the regular news pages not being biased. So here's an example of the Globe newspaper, another big city paper. And I just want you to look at the language used in the headline, in the secondary headline or the subhead. This is about the sinking of the Titanic. Titanic inquiry on loss of 1,595 lives due to speed mania. In other words, the theory was that the boat was speeding to get somewhere, whereas as a matter of fact, the boat wasn't speeding anywhere. It was kind of nearly barely moving at night. So it goes on to say, last hours of the giant liner filled with unprecedented scenes of self-sacrifice and heroism. Astor, that's John Jacob Astor, the billionaire, put his wife in the boat and then made way for a woman, Mr. and Mrs. Strauss, some refusing to be saved with other, went down, clasped each other's arm. The band played Nearer My God to Thee as the ship sank. Well, that's just kind of juiced up, jazzed up language that was meant to play on the emotions and sensationalizing a horrible tragedy. Now, the New York Times coverage was far more tame. Their headlines strictly factual. Titanic sinks 4 hours after hitting iceberg. 866 rescued by Carpathia. That was another ocean liner. Probably 1,250 perished. Ismay say Mrs. Astor maybe noted names missing. And then the other columns, which are pretty hard to read, basically are just sort of sub-stories, sub-facts, sub-headlines that give more factual, more objective point of view than what is being portrayed in the Globe and a lot of other newspapers. So that's a prime example of the difference between the two. The inverted pyramid style is a style of reporting that is taught the world over. In fact, if you go on and take more writing and journalism classes in the Elliott School, you will be taught this method. If you think of how it works, it makes an awful lot of sense. So we all know what shape a pyramid is, right? It's a triangle with a wide base and a point at the top. If you invert it, if you turn it upside down, as shown in the example here, you have the inverted pyramid. And essentially, the most important information goes in that red part at the top. That's why it's the broadest. It's the intro or the lead, which answers as many of the 5 W's, who, what, when, where, and why, as possible within the first few paragraphs of a story. I would add the 5 W's plus H because I was always taught to try to get at the how of the story. And then the story goes on to key quotes from people who are figures of authority, supporting facts. In other words, information that backs up the lead or start of the story. And then it goes to, in the purple section, important facts, but less important, supporting quotes from other speakers. In the blue section where it says background information, that's going to give you the context for the story. In other words, if you're talking about a military base closing, it might start off the blue section by saying, the base was opened in 1955, blah, 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 and take you through a short history or chronology of the background. Now the point stuff at the very bottom there, that orange section says general information. That's stuff that could belong in a story, but if a story gets to be too long, it can simply be cut off at that point or any point up there. So the idea is that it's easy to quickly trim a story from the bottom out without losing essential facts. It's easier to write on a short deadline because reporters train themselves to where they're putting the most important information at the top of the story, not writing chronologically. And it's easier for readers to get a essence of a story at a glance. In other words, if all they do is read the first paragraph or two or three, they will know the essence of a story. They may not know the complete story, but in today's world of short attention span theater, they'll at least get the idea for what the main points of the story are. Now, it started off, the inverted pyramid style started back roughly around the time of the Civil War, because I mentioned earlier that a lot of times troops would cut telegraph wires. And so it was very important if someone was reporting from Atlanta and trying to send information back to New York by telegraph wire, if they even got a few paragraphs into the story, if the telegraph wires went down, either from weather or accidentally or because they were cut by troops, that at least the essence of a story would get through to New York, even if the entire story didn't get there. So it also became an easy, quick way to trim during a period before the invention of electronic type. In other words, back when we were still setting type by hand and trimming by hand. Now, that's less of an important feature nowadays because we can very quickly change content on the fly electronically, which is the way everything's assembled these days. So you don't necessarily have to cut things to the bottom, but it's still good storytelling to get the most important stuff on top. So this is the pyramid, inverted pyramid style is the one that you'll probably be taught if you go to classes like COM 301 and other types of writing classes, at least as one of the forms of writing. Feature writing offers different setups and models, but this is one of the key ones. So I wanted you to know that. A form of journalism has been around in various forms since the 1920s and 30s, called interpretive journalism. Later this was called scientific journalism, as people sought to prove the value of news by using various scientific and statistical methods. But as the world did become more complex in the 1920s and 30s, it caused readers and journalists who were moving out of a sort of a craftsman position to where journalism was more of a professional or professional type position, to try to make sense of the world, not just write about it. So Time magazine, of course that's not a newspaper, but was one of the early practitioners of this in 1923. Global instability, like in cases like the Great Depression and the Nazi threat in the 30s, really led readers to want to know more about why things were happening. They wanted deeper explanations of and more context for all the chaos that was erupting around them. So I've got a picture up there at the top, is a photograph or variation of the photograph called Migrant Mother, or Migrant Mother, shot by a photographer named Dorothea Lange, a very famous Work Projects Administration photograph, and then below is a picture of Hitler. So those just symbolize a couple of the threats, and as readers started learning more and more about this sort of stuff because of the Depression and because of global wars, they started to get more and more concerned about what was going on in the world around them being explained. So this is the start where people who were experienced journalists, in other words, people in radio like Edward Murrow and other types that are and his counterparts in radio and in the newspaper world and later the television world, would be so well equipped to talk about an issue, what we would call commentators on TV nowadays. They would know the background of all these people. They would know the historical background. They would know the reasons why certain leaders were saying certain things. So they added this element of not just telling you just the facts, but saying what this all means is this, and with the idea that you are going to be able to separate that interpretation or that analysis from just the basic facts. The problem was that some readers still were confused by this blend of factual reporting and opinionated analysis, because analysis is opinion. It's saying, well, we think this is going to happen based on this, and we think that so-and-so is going to act this way, and they may or may not. And we find up to and including our last presidential election that a lot of the prognosticators and analysts in the media and in the outside world were wrong about who was going to win the election. Trump won, not Clinton or Bernie Sanders. So this interpretive journalism, which later on became known as scientific journalism, was really important, a turning point in the way journalists framed their work and tried to educate readers. Now, another thing, the book talks about a lot more things, but I wanted to focus very briefly on what are called niche newspapers. This is much more common in magazines, not in newspapers. If you go to a large bookstore and you go to the magazine section, for example, there seems like there's a magazine or a multitude of magazines about the most arcane subjects. You know, if you're interested in lizards, you know, if you do enough checking, there's probably 5 different magazines published about lizards. If you're interested in cars, there's maybe 50 or 100. So those magazines all appeal to a special group of readers who have special interests. There are still some niche newspapers. They're not as common as they used to be. Most of them are based on ethnic backgrounds or minorities, and sometimes financial newspapers. Now, if you ever want a good project for a history class or a media class, look into the history of African American newspapers in this country. They go back a long time, a couple hundred years to, one good one was the Chicago Defender. And these had long production runs, and they covered issues primarily of interest to African Americans. And there's many more examples of that. Now, what I put up here was a publication called Community Voice, which is published in Wichita. This is from a couple years ago, I think. November of 2015. And it's has shifted from being a pretty ragged-looking newspaper to being a full-color, nice publication. For a while, there was a Hispanic magazine in Wichita. I believe it's out of business. But here's one called La Estrella from Dodge City, Kansas. And then the Wichita Business Journal here in Wichita is publishing. And it's devoted strictly or mostly to financial news. So a niche newspaper is simply one that's intended for a specific audience or a specific topic. Not as common as niche magazines, but still quite a few of them published. So the book talks about some major national newspapers to know. And you should know this for the next test. You should be able to pick these out of a list. New York Times, the Washington Post, USA Today. Interesting story behind the way USA Today was formulated. I believe it was founded in 1984 and by Gannett. And the publisher, the guy who started it, was wanted to publish a national newspaper. In other words, he was aimed it towards business travelers for one, but also people who just wanted to get a quick glimpse of the news. And he was pretty much laughed at when he started. I think Al Newhart started the paper. When he first started it, because one of the features they had was every state in the country had, and still has, a little blurb about some news event going on in that state. They have sports scores. They're heavy on sports scores. They're heavy on color, use of color. They were one of the first national newspapers to go almost full color. And the idea was the busy traveler would go from airport to airport, and let's say they were leaving and go from Wichita and going to Boston. They'd grab it at the airport, read it on the plane, get caught up on maybe the most important story going on in Boston and surrounding states, on certainly on the major stories all over the country, catch up on their sports stories, and have something to talk about when they got to their business destination. And then when they got on a plane that night, they go to San Francisco, they pick up another copy or the next day's copy and do the whole thing. So USA Today there was not a lot of promise held out for it, but it's succeeded wildly. It's a major paper. So USA Today, the Wall Street Journal, which, believe it or not, is not just about financial news. Some of the best feature writing in the country is in that paper, particularly on the front page. The Los Angeles Times and the Chicago Tribune are all major players. Chicago used to have a newspaper called the Sun-Times. It failed financially, and the Tribune is left. So just know those 6 papers. And of course, you know, as far as local papers go, there's the Wichita Eagle. There's a sort of a newspaper / magazine. It's more of a newspaper called Active Aging for older citizens. There's the Sunflower, of course, which is the official newspaper, Wichita State University, and has been for well more than 100 years. And so those are some of the major papers you should know about anyway. Got 4 slides on various newspaper challenges. These illustrations are here just for fun. These are for real. But one of the things that newspaper faced starting in the 30s, increasing into the 40s and 50s, and even till today, is competition for broadcasting. So radio obviously is free except for buying a radio set, and a lot of times now it's free anyway. It became popular in the 30s, as we know, so readers became fervent listeners, and that meant that the amount of money that advertisers were spending on radio, a lot of times because newspapers are more expensive, they weren't getting as much ad revenue. Newsreels that were shown at movie theaters provided another source of news and competition. Newsreels were very short features, and they became really popular in World War II, where you go to the theater very frequently, like people did during the war. I remember movie attendance peaked in 1946. They would see a series of short films about what was going on in the Philippines with the war, or the bombing of Japan, or something like that. And then in the 50s, when television got really popular, that created more competition for news. What newspapers did in response to that was they created opinion pages and what are called op-ed pages. Op-ed is just short term for opposite of the editorials. So a lot of newspapers have editorials on the left side. This is opinion that they've written. And then on the op-ed page, on the opposite side of the facing page, the right-hand page, they'll have columns from guests. They'll have comments from readers, and letters and things like that. A lot of newspapers are cutting back on the number of pages they provide for opinion writing and op-ed pages, because those pages usually don't have advertising on them, which means they're costing more money than they're creating. So, but these illustrations, the one on the top, apparently there was a move back in the day. I've seen some other examples and stories that this invention of a radio set that prints a newspaper was there. And apparently there was a brand that was put in production. I've seen other pictures of other models, and basically it's just, in addition to having a radio there, once a day it would print out a synopsis of news articles. And I got to tell you, I'm not sure how it worked. Apparently there was also at least work on a television newspaper, and this is interesting because this looks very much like when you go to the library and put on microfiche or microfilm, either one, and you scroll through an old newspaper and see the newspaper show up on your screen. And the idea was that people would have these units at home, and in addition to watching television, you may be able to see a visual copy of that day's newspaper. And of course, this has all come to pass, in terms of being able to read websites, newspaper websites. Even some papers do produce their full pages you can look at. The Sunflower, for example, does that. So I just thought these were fun to look at and wonder about, and I like the kooky advertising, the kooky series there. So that's all that's for. Another challenge to the newspaper comes from public access to news, and I want to talk about the difference between the traditional gatekeeping function of newspapers and the way things are now. Newspapers for a long time, even to the present, most newspapers consider themselves gatekeepers. They decide what's newsworthy, and that means what you read, and they decide how to present it. In other words, if a story goes on page 1, they're going to assume that you're going to assume that they think that's more important than a story's on page 28. So they categorize this news, or index the news is what it's termed, and decide what you read and how it's presented. They do believe sincerely that because they have training to do their job, that they are the guardians of the facts and the truth. And of course, a lot of traditional newspaper people get really upset when politicians and others try to tell them that their facts are not facts, and basically that facts and truth are in the eye of the beholder. They try to be non-biased and objective. There's an interesting study that showed that when they did a lot of interviews and focus groups with journalists, the journalists tend not to be, the actual people who write and report stories and the editors tend not to be ultra-conservative or ultra-liberal. They pretty much are down the middle of the road in terms of their personal belief systems. And that's partly reflected because that's the way they are, which makes them a natural for the newspaper business, the mainstream newspaper business. And it works in reverse. After so many years of doing that, they stay middle of the road. They really, most mainstream journalists do not enjoy or practice fabrication or plagiarism, stealing, or misrepresenting the facts. And I say this knowing that politicians and members of the public don't believe this. And that's too bad because, this was a field I worked in for a long time, and I know a lot of people that worked in it. And I can't think of anybody that set out to manufacture a story. I know some people that did, and of course they got fired, and there were corrections printed, things like that. That's extremely rare, and you just have my word to take it on. So that's what I mean by saying the vast majority of mainstream newspaper journalists take their jobs very seriously, because at most publications you don't follow these principles and you get fired. And then you never work in the business again because your reputation precedes you. But like I said, the backlash is that many people don't trust journalists, and they instead use social media, word of mouth, their own beliefs, and other, I will say, unreliable methods to determine what the truth is. Studies have shown that once people have a belief, whether it's a religious belief, a political belief, any kind of personal belief, it's very hard for people to change their opinions about anything, no matter what the press or the media or the government says. And that's as I say, a known fact. So it's hard to change people's minds. Now, one important function of newspapers that's related to all this is the watchdog function. Newspapers often, journalists I should say, often think of themselves as being the fourth estate. In other words, there's the legislative branch of government, the executive branch of government, and the judicial branch of government. The media, the press in particular, often sees itself as that fourth branch of government, unofficially, and their job is to watch over those other branches to make sure there's not crimes and illegal things and bad things being done, which is why when the media reports on a crooked politician or a bad policy or some sort of social problem, inequity, they're attempting to make sure people know about that and that repercussions take place for people who are evildoers. And again, I'm not sure the public believes that, but that's what the intent of that function, their way of thinking is. A prime example of that is way back in the day, in the 70s, early 70s, when Richard Nixon's former President Richard Nixon was involved in a break-in at the Watergate apartment complex, in which he and other people from his administration sent people over to burglarize the Democratic National Headquarters, steal documents, and they were caught. And then the Washington Post found out about that, and a very young but determined pair of reporters, Woodward and Bernstein, found out about it, started writing stories. The government kept telling them that the press was lying, and even other newspapers didn't believe much of what the Post was saying, and even some other people at the Washington Post didn't believe that it was right to publish information that eventually led to Nixon resigning and his presidency going down in flames. But the fact of the matter is that the Post was right, and Watergate happened, and it took down a president and changed for a while the fundamental way we do business. So this is why it's very important for, the good guys in journalism to maintain or try to build their reputation as being ones who are looking out for the general public, looking out for you and me, since we can't be in every courtroom or every city hall meeting or on the streets of every city watching what's going on. So I hope that you're getting a little bit of sense from this, that although I realize that, like in every industry, there are bad people, that my firm belief is there are more good journalists, and I will say more specifically good newspaper journalists, than people think there are. Television is kind of a different discussion because of the visually competitive nature of television and the fact that there are so many more television stations than newspapers. I think that television does go off the mark sometimes in sensationalizing stories and things like that, but that's for us to debate some other time. The other newspaper challenge that's really one of the other newspaper challenges is declining readership. People just don't read newspapers like they used to. Part of that is based on the fact that the newspapers' readers are an aging population. People who developed the habit when they were, 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago, and they're dying out, literally. And so there are fewer subscriptions. But the fear of losing print media began in the 1940s, and it came again from the fact that there was competition from radio and television and movies. And then later on from arcade and video gaming. Some of you are old enough to remember when you actually went to a game arcade and played those what are now classic video games, as opposed to playing them on your computer at home on your phone screen. The internet obviously was the major thing that probably changed people's desire to buy newspapers, and along with social media and various ways you can play games and look at news and be entertained there. So people have also less time and money to read the news, and a lot of it is available for free as opposed to paying a subscription. Now, the Eagle has special deals, for example. They have an introductory subscription rate of $1.99 for, I think it's 4 months. And then I don't know what it goes up to after that. It's still relatively cheap because they've had to go digital just like everybody else. But as these newspaper readers age, there are not younger readers replacing them because of the other ways in which they're technologically fresher, more interesting ways in which people can get their news. People get their, quote, news, unquote, from blogs. And all blogs are one person's opinion of what's going on. Sometimes supported by the facts, sometimes not. Wikipedia itself is built by regular human beings who have their own built-in biases. And unless they're from a very reputable source, everything in a Wikipedia entry is suspect for being truthful and accurate. But a big example, and the book, I could give you a ton, but the book has this example, the Rocky Mountain News. Rocky Mountain News was a fairly good-sized publication, newspaper. It started publishing in 1859, and a few years ago, in 2009, they quit publishing after 150 years. And it was simply they didn't have the advertising base, because advertisers are also taking their business elsewhere. to social media, to the internet, to TV, and even to radio, because radio advertising is relatively cheap. So this is a copy of their last page, front page, and it looks like they went back and got a old style font for the flag, Rocky Mountain News, and they've gone back to old style, looking like a 19th century newspaper on the far left and far right columns. And then in the middle is the statement from the publisher or the editor in more modern layout fonts saying goodbye. Now, Rocky Mountain, later on, after they ceased their print publication, they have formed an online version of it. I believe some former employees did that, and they are publishing as of the date of this recording. So the paper didn't totally die, but the print edition did, and that's increasingly what we're seeing. The last slide on this section, it talks about declining advertising revenues, and some other trends, which I've hinted at. After our recent, within the last 10 years, several U.S. economy crashes, advertisers have had less to spend, and so they switched from print to online because it's cheaper. It's cheaper to put those annoying online ads whenever you call up the internet or Facebook or whatever than it is to put an ad in a local newspaper. Newspaper classified ads, most newspapers used to have pages and pages and pages of classified ads. They're way down. They're almost non-existent. In fact, the Sunflower really doesn't have them anymore. They used to have quite a few because there are a lot of free internet sites out there that allow you to post. Craigslist is one of them. There's others that allow you to post your stuff for free or nearly free. So why pay $12, $15, $20 for a classified ad when you can do it for free? And because everybody else is on the internet and on social media, you have a much more likelihood of seeing it. As these newspapers have failed or gone out of business, like the Rocky, some of the big chains like Gannett and McClatchy owns the Kansas City newspaper and the Wichita paper, have gobbled up these larger papers. So there's this trend towards consolidations by the big chains like Gannett and McClatchy. Small town newspapers are failing rapidly. I mean, a lot of them are gone. Compared to 25 years ago, the number of small town papers in Kansas, for example, is just horribly, horribly down. But most printed papers, most papers are still being printed, have finally come around to the 21st century and are now sharing their content online. For many, many years, decades even, newspapers were very slow to respond to online, and the reason was they could never gather enough advertisers to support an online thing. But they finally realized they had to do it anyway. The way newspapers are starting to pay for this online content is through what are called paywalls. And I mentioned the $1.99 subscription for the first 4 months version to the online newspaper, the Eagle. That is intended they're finally realizing they have to wean themselves away from providing everything for free and making people pay to look at the newspapers. So the Eagle is especially far behind on that, but other papers now, there's still some ways to get free newspapers online. There's a lot of papers are still reluctant to put in paywalls, but it's the only way they're going to survive these days, because the idea of subscriptions to the regular printed paper, they're kind of going away. So that is the end of part 3. That's the end of chapter 4 on newspapers. I hope you kind of enjoyed it, and we will see you again for the next time. Arrivederci.